by sharing a little bit of like the genesis of how this came about by telling you the story of my grandmother. She was not in the military. So this was in Asia, in what's currently Malaysia, was formerly called British Malaya, or the Straits Settlements, and it was a British colony. And people were getting word that the Japanese, as the Japanese were invading down the peninsula, there was widespread rape. And my great-grandparents heard about this and they got really scared and they were trying to figure out what to do. And they had heard that while there was rape, there was an honor code for these soldiers. They wouldn't rape females if they were married. So they arranged for my grandmother to get married. Here's the kicker. She was only 13. And contrary to what I think Westerners believe, arranged marriages were not that common. It really wasn't common at all. So it was a big deal. So my great-grandparents found someone who was 18. He was a policeman, so I thought, okay, good guy. And they remained married until my grandfather passed away in 1985. They had 4 children. So I guess it sort of turned out. I sort of wonder what she would think about halfway around the world, there were these 2 women who had options and freedom and were trying to win this war. I never got a chance to talk to her about that. I was always kind of nervous as I grew up. And obviously she passed. So one of the takeaways is talk to your relatives, talk to the older people before it gets too late. So I know Blake's done that, you've done that. So let's get started. All right. So, actually, before we get started, can we just do some definitions so we're all on the same page? So we've heard about like wax and waves. Your great aunt was in the wax, right?
That's right.
Tell us about the wax. What were the wax? And what does it stand for? So it's not WWII.
It's not. The WACs were originally formed as the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps in 1942, I believe. And they lost the auxiliary portion of that terminology and became the Women's Army Corps in 1943. So they were designed to be a way to extend the ability of the military to conduct a lot of the business of the military domestically primarily, to allow for the enlisted men to go further, to stretch their resources further.
But it started as WAAC.
That's right.
What's the difference?
The women's, as I have researched this, it's fascinating to see the headwinds behind this idea. I mean, there was a whole lot of opposition amongst the regular military to women serving in the military at all, and they had to really fight the battles. I think about this, and I'll say this to start about my great aunt Elizabeth. I just can't imagine the position she found herself in, and why she would try to enlist, join the WACs, the WAAC, or it became the WAC, amidst all this opposition to it. But they did, she did. And just like your grandmother found herself in a set of circumstances in Malaysia, and Elizabeth found herself in a circumstance, and she rose to the occasion, and she joined, she was in the Red Cross, serving in the Red Cross initially, and then they formed the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps, May of 1942, and she was one of the first people to sign up. And then less than a year later, they dropped the auxiliary out of that designation and became the Women's Army Corps.
Yes. So Jamie, over to you to talk about the waves.
So the waves, actually, I just want to back it up a second and say that it's such a pleasure to be here. I discovered, I don't know about you, Blake, but I discovered a lot about my step-grandmother, Mildred, because of this event. I knew some of what I'm about to recount when I was a boy, but I'll get to that in a second. There are some really fabulous memories of how that knowledge came to be. But the waves, the women accepted for voluntary emergency service. And interestingly, I found out that name was determined after the acronym. So it was, they were already the waves, and I forget who it was, but came up with that, the women accepted for voluntary
Probably
emergency
some
service.
surfer, right?
Yeah. But that's how that came to be.
Thank you, I did not know that. By the way, Captain Mildred Horton has a Wikipedia page, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I am understandably very proud to be her grandson. But Mildred, and I think the same is true of Elizabeth, you said, she was not one to parade her own successes at all.
She has no Wikipedia page.
But,
Maybe we should change that.
but I encourage anybody who wants to know more details to Google Mildred, and therein you will find some really quite wonderful stuff, much of which we won't touch on this evening.
Yeah, and sorry, I should have mentioned, I know that we all have, many of you have stories about your relatives who were in the war. I know the Finneys, Eleanor Sanborn Finney was in the waves. Where's Kempe? Kempe, your mother was in the waves too, right? So I'm gonna mention this at the end, but I'll mention it again. We want those stories. If you can write them down, send them to Yvonne and myself. I think it would be a really fun project. We're not sure what to do yet, but we'll collect them, we'll compile them, and then we'll find a way to disseminate that out, right? Yvonne, we'll figure it out. But
Can I say
Yeah.
something?
So to that point, I spent a day, I knew of Aunt Elizabeth's service in World War II very, very vaguely for, I guess, my life. But when she was about 95, I intentionally went to spend a weekend with her and collected these stories. And I pulled out her box of medals and her news clippings and all. She had never shared those. She didn't want to talk about them. I said, why don't you want to talk about them? And she said, they're all about me. Why would I want to talk about them? But I interviewed her for the better part of 2 days, and I wrote down these stories into this little article. And it's one of the things that I'm so glad I did. And I would encourage everybody to do that if you have the chance to do that. And Yvonne and I had a conversation a couple of years ago about this. This was not in the archives over at the library, and these stories ought to be shared in the archives. So please do that if you have the opportunity to do it.
And if you're interested, if you go to the either table, we have this as a PDF. You just can scan. There's a QR code you can scan, or go to the website. You can download that PDF of Blake's writings from 1999.
It's a wonderful article.
Thank you.
I mean, it's so cool that you did that too. Had the patience to sit down. and
It
do
was
that.
so fun.
Everyone always wants to know. So did Mildred and Elizabeth know each other here in Randolph?
Well, we talked about this last night, and we're not really sure, are we, about this? We had heard from somebody that they had known each other during the Second World War, which wouldn't surprise me at all, given their rank in the military. But the Randolph connection is something that you said was through their honeymoon here originally. Am I right?
I would love to. The other reaction to this little article, this exercise of mine, is that I didn't ask nearly enough questions. And I don't know. I don't know exactly how Aunt Elizabeth met Joe Walsh, but I know that they met and communicated throughout World War II. Joe Walsh was in the Navy, and she was in the WWII, and they would write letters back and forth, and they got promotions essentially on the same timetable and ended up at about the same rank at the end of the war. I'm not sure where they met, but there's a couple of spots that they could have met. And Elizabeth spent a year at Radcliffe. She's from Nashville, Tennessee, educated at Vanderbilt. So she was also at Western Kentucky University. I know your grandmother was at Center College down that way for a little bit. So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, good
I like
question.
Lily, I think Lily's got the answer to that.
She may, and we can get to that. We're not quite sure.
Okay.
So, do you mind if I just pitch in that? Because I know a little bit about how Mildred and Douglas, met and got married, and there was this, she's pictured over there on the, March 1945 cover of Time magazine. So this was a story that came down through the family, and this was one of the things that I was aware of as a child. That there was some, and my father told this, and it's gone through various iterations, but the story goes something like this, and I'll get some of this right, I promise. My father was serving in the Pacific.
And your father is?
Alan Horton. And the three girls had already met Mildred McAfee, had been introduced to them by their dad, Douglas Horton. But my father was in the Pacific and was out of touch. My father and his father had developed a code that they used in letters to each other. And in this letter that my father wrote, there were the initials MHM. That was the code that kept repeating itself. And on board ship somewhere in the Pacific, my father had the military issue of the Time magazine cover. And he looked down and saw the name Mildred Helen McAfee. And that's how he learned that that's who my grandfather was marrying in 1945.
That's so cool. Now, I know Mildred she was born in Missouri, so how did she get here? Douglas?
Yes. She was born into a family. Her father, her grandfather were both Presbyterian ministers. She was steeped in the church and ended up coming back to that later in her life after the Second World War. And then he had built the home here in 1939 or so with his wife Carol Williams, and then Mildred joined him sometime after they were married in 1945.
Blake, yesterday in the movie, the 6 AAA, it was Fort Oglethorpe was where they were stationed, right? And that's also where Aunt Elizabeth was stationed.
Right.
You had told me a story about when General Marshall came to visit. Can you tell everybody that story? I think it's just the coolest story ever.
Yeah, do you mind if I back up and say a little bit? So Aunt Elizabeth was educated at Vanderbilt University. She got her master's at Peabody to become a teacher, and was a teacher of math at a school in Augusta, Georgia, and then at Western Kentucky University. And so I'm kind of getting at the point of, like, how did she make this decision that led her to Fort Oglethorpe? She was traveling in 1939, and she was in England, and things were getting tense. The American ambassador called all the Americans in to come for a meeting and say, you need to go home, and there's an American ship that's leaving tomorrow, and it'll be safer than the British ship that you were originally planning to take back, because America's not involved in the war, and we recommend that you do this. If you don't do this, you'll be traveling at your own risk. And Elizabeth said, well, at whose risk will we be traveling if we take our original plan, transportation home? And he's like, well, your own risk, obviously. But so she stuck with the original plans and stuck around for a couple of weeks extra in England, and ended up in Parliament and watched the debate between Neville Chamberlain and Winston Churchill about the threats that Hitler posed. And she said that was a key part of her decision making. So that inspired her to get involved. She was a member of the Red Cross and led Red Cross initiatives. And then I'm getting to the answer to your question, because that's one of my favorite stories of this whole interview. But then she was she was at a dinner party, and somebody said no self-respecting woman would ever join the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. And she said, she didn't say anything for a minute or two, and then she said, I consider myself to be self-respecting, and I'm going to join tomorrow. And she did. And she was one of the first classes of Women's Auxiliary Army Corps candidates. and she moved up through the ranks, and then she was named to the commandant of Fort Oglethorpe. And 10 days after she was named commandant, General Marshall informed her that her office that he wanted to join or to come and inspect the base, which I understand was in horrible shape before at certain points, but then was much better after a while. But General Marshall came and he said, but it's got to be a secret. Nobody can know that I'm coming. And this was with 10 days notice, and he arrived on base, and the parade grounds were immaculate, and all the women were dressed in their uniforms, just perfectly attired and very impressive. And he said, this is all fantastic, but I asked you not to let them know I was coming. And Elizabeth, I got vivid memories of her telling me the story, and she got this twinkle in her eye, and she said, she responded by saying, you know how quickly rumors get going in the military? Somehow they found out that Frank Sinatra was coming.
That's my favorite story about that. Did they know each other up here in Randolph? Do we know?
Yes, he did.
Yes, I know that so Anne Elizabeth married Joe Walsh right at the end of the war, and they honeymooned here, and I believe they were really good friends up here, and had a long relationship. I don't know if they knew each other before, but I know they knew each other here and really enjoyed each other's company here.
They have like an Army-Navy football rivalry sort of thing.
I don't know.
We're sort of, do you want to talk more about her during the war? Because I'm so interested in her kind of immediately after. Also, I mean, I don't want to go through her whole bio, but she was also the president of Wellesley College.
Yeah, I can tell you a little bit. She was after one of the things that I remember as a kid was that her dates were really easy to remember because she was born in 1900, so I always knew how old she was. It was really simple to guess. But in 1936, she was appointed as the 7th president of Wellesley College at the age of 36, and she was the youngest college president ever appointed. And it was while she was at then in 42, she was asked to by the military brass of the Navy to become the first lieutenant commander of the Waves, and a year later was promoted to captain as part of a declaration creating the U.S. Navy Reserve. And so she was the first commissioned officer female commissioned officer in the Navy Reserve. And then after the war, she went back to the presidency of Wellesley until 49.
I know we shouldn't really depend so much on Wikipedia, but Wikipedia did say that she was instrumental in getting people of color, women of color, into the U.S. Naval Reserve officers.
Yeah, she had a major role in that, and I believe that is also true of Elizabeth. She was instrumental in bringing women of color into the officer corps when many of their male counterparts were doing more menial jobs, the African American troops and others. So she was an advocate for the people of color throughout her military history, and as a matter of fact, in her later church life also. So that was a thing that I found really fascinating about that movie last night. The thing that really rang true for me was that Elizabeth and Mildred were outstanding women, but in a wide range of truly outstanding women that would include all those people that were part of the 688. And if Mildred and Elizabeth were here tonight, I know they would speak about the fact that yes, they were leaders in this movement, but it was those women and people like your grandmother who were outstanding in a completely different way. But in Mildred's case, I can't remember the numbers, but by the time at VJ Day, on August 10, 1945, so 80 years ago this Friday, Mildred commanded 82 to 86,000 women in the waves, and the initial target for that had been 10,000. So that is the generation of extraordinary women of which they were a part.
And so Fort Oglethorpe had like 50,000 soldiers there.
So we're trained there.
Yeah, that were trained there. So I sort of wondered, like, that's a lot of people, and they're also the kind of the first of their kind. It's not like there was a training manual. Like, how did they navigate it? Like, how did they, you know?
No, I think that's a great question, one that I've spent time thinking about, especially as I was researching and looking at the WAC's Wikipedia page. And like, to your point, who knows if this is accurate, but there's a whole lot of the page that's dedicated to the opposition efforts on the military, and how people were suggesting that the WACs were there to boost morale, and the morale boosting was through sexual support of the men, and I mean just a lot of really negative stuff that came about out of that. So I think about Anne Elizabeth, and she was Vanderbilt graduate, had her master's, had from a reasonably well-to-do family in Nashville, and she decides to place herself squarely in the middle of that. And at the age of a lot of the young people in the Randolph community, Eliza is just a little bit older than you are, and I think about that, and it just is so impressive to me that she would do that and make those choices and fight those battles. And she also, another story she told me, she was the assistant commandant under 3 men before she was promoted to commandant. And I remember asking her, what was the difference when you were promoted to commandant? She said, no difference. I was doing the work previously. So I think that,
Jamie, here's to our relatives, and here's to all the women.
This is a theme that Mildred spoke at various points in her life about, was that how she became accustomed to the male Navy brass and how she got what she wanted. And I have a couple of brief stories. The first one was an argument with the Chief of Naval Personnel, Rear Admiral Randall Jacobs. She was trying to convince him that the waves should wear tan stockings instead of black. And it was, believe it or not, rather a significant victory for her. She won that one. But my favorite story is that from the Wellesley magazine, she talked about how all the ideas that came out of the waves and how she navigated the male hierarchy of the U.S. Navy. And she said, and I quote, it was by convincing the Navy brass that all of the good ideas that the waves brought to the table were in fact theirs. And she said this about that: I remember all of us felt positively embarrassed about this, how perfectly stupid to resort to this technique, but we tried it and boy, it worked fine. And I love that because it was a man's world that they were navigating, and as in the movie last night, that was paramountly clear. That cracker general that was represented that cadre of the American military, and the fact that your great aunt and my grandmother were able to navigate that so successfully is a testament to a lot of savoir-faire, as we say.
Jamie, one question. I've never met Captain Horton, president of Wellesley. How tall was she?
She was about 5'3.5" at her highest, and she probably ended up at about 5'1". And she was so small that when the great cops here in Randolph, they would follow her into town, into Gorham, and they would pick her up when it comes out on Route 2, and from behind you couldn't see Mildred at the wheel. And they would ride in behind her, and she did her stuff, and they would ride her back all the way. And she was. You mind if I tell one more story?
This is the one I want you to tell.
Okay. Which one? Yes. So this was one of my at the ripe old age of 93. She died at the age of 94. And during this period of time, the Randolph community was unbelievably generous and helpful to her, and Alan and Lucille Lowe were really significant in that effort, but a lot of people. But at one time, Mildred's stepchildren, Peggy, Alice, Betty, and Alan, all decided that she shouldn't sleep in her recliner chair anymore. It was not good for her. So they asked Alan Lowe to come and pick it up and take it away. So Mark Santos, his son-in-law, was the first to knock on the door. And Mildred opened the door, and Mark said, "Hello, Mrs. Horton, I'm here to help Alan take away your recliner chair." Mildred wasn't hearing any of that. She was determined to keep that damn recliner chair. And she pulled herself up, all 5'3.5" of her, and got on her famous Captain Mac feeling. And she pointed at him and she said, "Get out of my house." So, dutifully, Mark Santos turns around and stands in the garage. And one of the great things about getting older is that the tape that you run, needless to say, gets a little shorter. And Alan Lowe turns up about 10 minutes later, and the two of them come up to the door. Mildred opens the door. Alan Lowe says, "We're here to take your recliner, Mildred." And she says, "Oh, do come in." And they took away the recliner chair without any further confrontation. So that's
Great story. I'm sorry, Blake.
That's okay. I was just gonna add on a little bit about navigating in the men's world in the 40s. This isn't a story about Ann Elizabeth and Fort Oglethorpe, but I guess I can infer something from this story that my aunt Martha told me today. I was talking to her about Ann Elizabeth, and she said, we were just reminiscing about a lot of things, and she said, she was a horrible driver. She got so many speeding tickets, and she had a lot of wrecks too, and she never got ticketed for it. She was such a southern woman that she would just kind of smile and bat her eyes at the officer, and they always let her go. So I guess that might have been one of the skills in her skill set that allowed her to navigate that woman.
How tall was Ann Elizabeth?
She was she was 5'7" or 8" or so. She probably had shrunk a bit by the time of my interview, but yeah, she was more of a commanding woman. My Aunt Martha also said that she was very strong-willed, very opinionated, very stubborn, very frugal, and I can imagine those skills serving her quite well, especially when combined with the ability to turn on the Southern charm.
Did she have a Southern accent?
You
don't realize that you have a
Do I have a Southern accent?
He does, right?
No. Actually, I think Della and I came up here for the first time in probably the 80s, and I'd gotten invitations from Aunt Elizabeth all these years, and I never accepted. And I remember one time that Della and I came up in the 80s, and Aunt Elizabeth really loved having us setting up these cocktail sessions with the Mules and the Mays and all these folks, and Della and I were convinced that she'd like to do it so that they could hear the Southerners talk, wait for our accent and what might come out of our mouths.
Tell us a little bit about how you ended up, our neighbor, how you ended up in the house. Like, did she have children?
Ann Elizabeth and Joe Walsh were married on April 2nd, 1946, right after the war, because nobody would get married on April Fool's Day. They honeymooned up here that summer, and she spent, I think, most of the summers ever since, until she died, or until very late in her life. Della and I came up here starting in the 80s, and once we came up, we didn't miss a summer. maybe one. And as Aunt Elizabeth was aging and couldn't come up anymore, she had kind of shared her idea of leaving the cabin to Harvard. And my cousin Julia, with whom I own the cabin, said to Aunt Elizabeth, there's another option, and we would prefer you to think about that. And Aunt Elizabeth left it to us instead. So I just think about how many opportunities could have gone differently that would have kept us from sitting here, kept Aunt Elizabeth from doing the things that she did. But just how glad I am that she made the choices she did, and that we're able to have this conversation tonight.
You're here.
I'm afraid to ask you of your family tree because it's a forest. I just met another Horton just now.
Yeah,
Second cousin.
Right.
Yeah. How big is the family? Tell us a little bit of like the major family tree with Douglas and Mildred.
Well, I think maybe the thing that is interesting is how this, how our sort of family compound came to be, and in '39, as I said, Douglas built the house at the top of the hill, and then, if my history is correct, gradually bought up the 3 or 4 properties around here, so that he could create a place where his children would continue to come. Fabulous Randolph tradition, and that is true to this day. When I first came to Randolph, I want to tell you a very quick story about that, but I'll do that in a second. But it was where all the cousins convened, and it was a belief of Douglas's and then of Mildred's later, that this was a way to keep a family together, and it really did. I got together with my cousins for years and years and years here, and it has meant the world. This community is truly, I don't have to tell anybody in this room, a very, very special community. And it has been important in our lives ever since we were kids. And there were a couple of things that I remember as a boy about Mildred, if you wouldn't mind. I remembered that when I came up here in high school, that one of the things that set my grandmother apart was, and surprised the heck out of me, was that all of my teenage friends from high school, when they came to visit here, wanted to go talk to Mildred, because she was a woman who kept up with the time. She didn't stay rooted in, and she was always very interested in asking them questions, and they found that conversation really intriguing enough so that happened every time they came up here. And that impressed the hell out of me. I thought that was really, and completely shocking. I remember her green polyester suit, which was mentioned in a letter that our daughter Jenna wrote at the age of 9, 2 days after Mildred had passed, because she too remembered her green polyester suit. And the other memory that I have when we first came back to this country, without knowing why at the time, is that Carol, Ted, and I would wake up at about 6 o'clock on Sunday morning and watch the Three Stooges on an early color RCA television, and which was the coolest dang thing. I mean, that was really, really fun. And I didn't find out until much later, of course, that Mildred was the first woman to serve on the board of the RCA Corporation, and that's why she had that television.
Amazing.
No, I was just going back to your family trees, just so everyone knows. So there's the Hortons, there's the Brunigs, there's the Grants,
And yeah, the Hortons, the Brunigs, the Grants, and the Tippets.
Okay. It's all over here. Anyone on the hill?
Well, cousins, second cousins, the Crarys. And those are the other folks with whom
Prairies.
our
That was not a jab at the hill.
Weren't you related to the Baldwins?
what's that?
Weren't you also related to the Baldwins?
Well, dear Harriet Brown Baldwin was Mildred's niece, and a dear friend of the family. And so we spent a great number of summers up here with them and their kids. And my parents stayed very close to Jim and Hattie until all the way through their later years. Dear folks, and Hattie was one of the few people that was at or told us about the wedding, Mildred and Douglas's wedding. But Harriet was a dear person.
Jamie, earlier I think I was a little premature in asking you about Mildred's post-military life and civilian life. Did she adjust to civilian life okay?
Yeah, I can't say she never relaxed too much. She was, she did a lot of things post-war. She was very, very active. And I think, and we talked about this, you and I, but she became a member of the Board of Trustees at the University of New Hampshire. And then president or chair of the board from 72 to 73. And do you mind if I tell that story?
Yeah.
I found this out as I graduated from high school, that Mildred was then head of the board at the University of New Hampshire, and she advocated for the gay student organization to give them the right to be officially recognized at the college, at the university. And it was a big battle, and she won, and it was put into law. But the memory that I have as a child or as a young man is that she got into a real wonderful fight with William Loeb, then publisher of the Manchester Union Leader. And her picture would appear above the title of the paper, needless to say, on the left. And William Loeb would appear on the right. And they went after each other for a long time. But I was so proud of her because one of the themes that I think ties these two wonderful women together is advocacy for people. And I think Elizabeth was the same in her position, and it was something as a young man that I was enormously proud of her for. And she fought the battle she needed to fight, and she won most of it.
How did Aunt Elizabeth adjust to civilian life? Do you know?
I think that's another thing that I've thought about. I think that Aunt Elizabeth is, I don't know all that she did post World War II, other than I know that she spent a lot of time supporting Joe Walsh in his career. And I think that that's an interesting dynamic, right? To go from a position where you're a commandant of a military institute and then you are not. And what do you do? So, hats off to Mildred, and hats off to all the women that served in this. But I had a conversation with Kempy the other day about that dynamic of stepping back down into a role where you're making dinners and such. What a crazy thing to go through. I think that Elizabeth spent a lot of time supporting Joe Walsh in his career.
Almost out of time, but do you have any kind of last stories you want to tell before I open it up to questions?
I think, if you don't mind, I'm going to rely on the brain that counts one more time. I think one of the things that I have one quick story about her the softball field, and the other thing that I wanted to just mention was the ongoing belief in the important role of women, and which is a theme that we began with tonight. And she wrote after the war that, quote, "The opening of these doors to military service does much to recognize women as full-fledged citizens. Perhaps a byproduct of that war experience will be a wider conviction of the supremacy of human nature over gender, that the basis of employment will come to be skill rather than sex." And she did the same when she went advocated for the women in the National Council of Churches, and was a big believer in the rightful place of women. She wrote the folly of a national policy discussing manpower in a national emergency as though it were only male power, adding that put women in the category of a national luxury instead of a national asset. And it was something she, and I think I would love to tell one quick story about Mildred, because how many people played softball in the field below Mildred's house? Yeah, quite a few. That's great. So I didn't know this story at all, but I found out from this article that she was known as Miss Mac when she was president of Wellesley. And on a Saturday afternoon, bucolic Saturday afternoon, she wandered down to the outside the gymnasium, the softball game, and said, "You got room for me?" And of course they did. She was the president of the college. So come on in. And they put her up on the batting team, and she got up, and the first pitch she hit a home run. At 5'3½". Not too dang bad, I thought. Anyway, that's mine.
I forgot to ask, how many in the audience have been or are currently members of the Mildred Horton Book Club? Whoa, yay. Nice. Wait, any last stories, Anna Elizabeth, you can think of? We'll open it up for questions.
Yeah, that's it. One of the things that concerned me about this idea was that, my experiences with Anna Elizabeth, and I knew of Mildred Horton and a couple of other names, but that there's got to be a whole lot of other people in Randolph that have connections and have stories. So if we run out of time tonight, I'd really encourage you to share them with Yvonne through the archives. I hope that's okay, Yvonne?
Yeah, can I say something too?
Sure.
In the library, since the library started, probably Mary Edgerly, I don't know if anyone remembers, she was the librarian for years and years. She kept every article that was ever written about anyone connected to Randolph. So they're not primary source documents, but they are newspaper articles. So Mildred did so much community service in Berlin and in Gorham, and it's all documented in newspaper articles with pictures and things. So if you really want to see them, please come in. You have this, they use it in the White Mountain Room, but we have a whole folder. And not only Mildred, but also Alan and Douglas and everything. So, and I agree with you that please share your stories. The Tibbets, a couple of years ago, Norris was asked to write his stories in the Navy, and he wrote them all up, and they printed them out, and I have a copy at the library. Alan Horton and Avery Post were both at Kendall, and someone went down to Kendall and collected all kinds of World War II stories from all of the residents of Kendall and put them into a book. So those are in the library as well. So yeah, please share. And please come and explore these files. There may be a file on your family in there too. They say everything, so please come check it out.
And just add on that I think that there's probably a lot of stories that are not told. I know that a lot of that generation didn't want to share their stories, so I would encourage people to take the initiative to go out and find those stories before it's too late, as Red was saying early on. One thing that struck me was I stopped down at the memorial in front of the old library the other day, and Joe Walsh, who was a commander in the Navy's name is not on that plaque. That he served in World War II, obviously, but so there's got to be some omissions that I think we can correct, and I hope we can correct those. Yeah, I'm not talking about adding Joe Washington. I'm talking about adding stories to the archive.
And just to go back, I think we all agree, talk to your relatives, write down these stories. And if you're not a great writer like these two, do what I do and just videotape them and video record. And if you don't have relatives, talk to an older neighbor before it's too late. So, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Blake. Thank you, Jamie. Thank you all for coming.
Do we want to do?
Yeah, we'll do Q&A.
Yeah, that's great.
Open it for Q&A, and Keith,
I just want to react one more thing. No, I don't have another story. This will be very brief. But I think what is clear to me again is how these two exceptional women who led by action and accomplishment and never gave up despite obstacles. And I just wanted to close with this, that there might always be periods of sliding back, Mildred said, but that's all right. The only way we'll get there is to keep trying. And she also said, I am a confirmed optimist anyway. And so I share it.
Me too. Here's to Mildred. and
Here's to
Elizabeth.
And so Keith is gonna pass the microphone around for questions.
Coming this way first.
Jamie, I think you said that Mildred became president of Wellesley in 1936. What do you know, and that she was the youngest president of Wellesley, what do you know about her life before then?
A little bit from my research that I just did at the age of 70, which I probably should have known a long time ago. But she was the Dean of Women at Oberlin. She was the Dean of Women at, yeah,
Kentucky.
in Kentucky. And she held a variety of positions before that, but that's the first major one, I think, that I recall from my reading. Yeah.
I think we have a question over here behind the bottom. Let's see who that is. Is that Larry? Larry, okay.
That's this down, Larry.
Thank you. I've been told that Randolph was one of the first places north of the mountains to receive telephone service. And I know James B. Conan, lived here as well as Mildred Gordon. And there's a few other notable people, Edward Purcell and Percy Bridgman. And, the network of people in the community at that point in time, it's just mind-boggling. Is anyone familiar with any of the stories from that period? Because the interconnectedness of, these notable people. Edward Purcell, he was responsible during World War II for development of the radar. And Percy Bridgman, was responsible for, he got a Nobel laureate, for atomic bomb casing. And I just can't even imagine, being a fly on the wall. And so, anyway, it spoke too much, but, it's just food for thought. And if anybody knows any history, I think it would be, well received.
John?
Just an observation, the first time we came here, we were on that party line. And there were many more people on that party line than active participants.
What'd you hear? Sarah?
Another amazing skill of Mildred's was her Kool-Aid making. For those of us who played softball in her yard on Sundays, we'd have to, she wouldn't bring it out to the game, but we would go into the foyer or the area before you entered the house, and she would make like green and red. I mean, nobody drinks this now, but at the time, we just thought it was incredible. And to think that this, high-powered woman would make us Kool-Aid every Sunday was kind of amazing.
The same color as her polyester suits.
Anybody else?
I had one, and I don't think I need a mic. And I'm sorry to pull it out to big picture stuff, but do either of you have any idea why the Germans didn't arm their women in World War II? They were kind of short-handed towards the end, and they were fighting on three fronts. The Red Army had them hugely outnumbered with women in the armed forces. And towards the end, I understand that at least some of the GIs had to fight with the equivalent of German Boy Scouts. You know, young 14-year-olds issued crummy old rifles and so on. So, I mean, do you think that ties in somehow to how fascism works? Or were we just forward time? Or what?
I think that question is probably beyond my pay grade.
I don't know, I think it's a great question.
There's a book in the library called The Women Who Flew for Hitler.
Okay.
It's a relatively new, it's a nonfiction, relatively new book.
All right, so maybe
You wanna
I'm
come check it out,
misinformed.
yeah. So
Our
I think the women were
librarian.
there, yeah.
Just a note as a historian, the part of the fascist slogan was the KKK, not the one we know from America, but Kinder, Küchen und Kirche, the women, the kitchen, and the church. And watch out, those same sentiments may be coming our way.
Any other questions?
Any others? Yes.
I would just like to get a little more filling out of what the function was of the waves and the wax. Like how were they? What were their jobs? What was it that they were fulfilling?
Because they were quite similar in both divisions.
Yeah, the WACs were designed, the purpose was to allow the military, the men in the military to focus on the things that they could do while the women would do things that they traditionally had been doing in the civilian world and doing much better than the men were doing. There were a lot of operators, there were a lot of mechanics in the WACs. So they were doing things that would allow the men to focus on the more military, I guess the weapons and such, the combat.
I remember the telegraph operators, they did everything.
Yeah.
They really did.
So like last night, the movie was about the wax, and they did the mail service. The men didn't do mail service. Wanna talk about the
They
way-
failed at it.
Thank you, Frank.
No, I think I would just say, similar, very, very similar.
One more question in the back.
I don't need a mic.
Oh.
I just wanted to say that, I was telling my brother that there were many women pilots in World War II. I know they had a name, but I don't remember what it was, but they were great pilots.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a major theme of this conversation tonight, is the extraordinary commitment and role that women have had in this period of time, and for that matter, every period of time.
All right, please thank Jamie and Blake for me. Thank you so much. All right, so they're gonna stick around, we'll mingle, and please help yourself to wine, champagne, cheese. Oh, Thomas, yes.
I just want to thank you, Red, for organizing this, because this is a great event, and this is something that I, growing up, heard these stories, but I don't know, I guess, to your point, like seeking them out is important, and then sharing them is important, yeah, thanks for doing this, it's great. I hope we have more events like this.
Yvonne, did you have the World War II music on for tonight?